Hi everyone and welcome back to Story of the World Highlights. Today we'll be discussing chapter 22. Now chapter 22 is a very detailed chapter that walks us through the lead up to the American Revolution. So let's look at the first bit of the chapter. In the beginning of the chapter, we have where we left off last time, which was the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War in the New World. Now, at the end of that war, Britain was losing a lot of money. That money was really expensive for that war. And England was also a new joined country. So it was called Great Britain now because it had formed with Scotland and Wales. So it had more people to take care of, and it had just spent a lot of money on a war. So it needed to find a way to get that money back. And Parliament decided that since the war happened in the New World, that the colonists were going to have to pay for it. And they were going to have to pay for it in the form of taxes. Now, the first tax that they had was called the sugar tax. And the sugar tax, like it sounds like, was in charge of taxing all sugar and molasses, which is a kind of sugar syrup that came into the New World. And so sugar became a lot more expensive. Then they had the stamp tax. Now, the stamp tax first started on paper goods like newspapers, but then it spread to things like certificates and any legal documents. They needed to get stamped or notarized. And this stamp cost money. That's why it's called the stamp tax or the Stamp Act, the law passed for it. Now, there were other acts or laws that were passed too against the colonists. And one of those was called the Quartering Act. And the Quartering Act meant that colonists had to provide housing and food to soldiers at any time on their own dime, on their own cost. So colonists were not too happy about that. Then finally, we had the tea tax. And the tea was a really big drink, more than coffee during those times. And they got teas in from all around the world. But one of the biggest teas that was coming in was being sold by the British East India Trading Company. And they decided to make all the other teas cost more money so that colonists would be forced to buy from this British trading company. And colonists hated this. They thought all of this was unfair because by British law, anyone in the British Empire getting taxed has to have a representative in Parliament defending them. And the colonists didn't have one. So they thought these taxes were just unfair. And they told the king that. They said, boo, we don't like this. We don't have any representation. This is illegal. And the king said, fine, fine, fine. And the king at the time was George III. And he said, okay, I will take away most of these taxes. But Parliament said, no. You at least have to keep the tea tax. And the colonists hated this. And so the colonists started to boycott or protest against buying tea. And they kept shouting the chant, no taxation without representation. Meaning we refuse to pay taxes if we're not being allowed a representative to speak for us in Parliament. So there was a lot of anger now with the colonists and Parliament and the British soldiers there. And the tensions were high. Easily people were on edge, worried. Are you attacking me? Is this a fight against me? A lot of worry. And so one day in Boston, there were people playing snowball fights in March of 1770, and a snowball hit a British troop, a British soldier. And he thought, oh, they must be attacking me. And so he immediately shot into the crowd and killed 5 people. The colonists said, oh, the British are killing us. There was 5 dead, and this was called by the colonists the Boston Massacre. And news spread of this to other colonies that the British had fired on colonists for no reason. And this made the anger towards the British rise and rise and rise. So we start to have lots of groups of colonists meeting and discussing, what can we do? This is not okay. And one group in Boston in particular was called the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty, they gathered to discuss what they could do for revenge. And they decided on something that was going to be called the Boston Tea Party. The plan was that in the middle of the night, they would all dress as Native Americans as a disguise. And then they would sneak onto the 3 boats that were currently in the harbor, carrying tea from the British East India Company. They would sneak onto the boats and they would use hatchets, axes, to chop at all the barrels and crates of tea, and then they would dump it in Boston Harbor. Now, this did become known as the Boston Tea Party, and they were successful in their mission to dump all the tea in the harbor. But this little protest had big consequences in Parliament. We had Parliament saying, hey, that tea was expensive. You just dumped so much money into the harbor. You deserve a punishment. And that punishment came in the form of some new laws that were passed against the colonists, particularly the ones in Boston, where the most protesting seemed to be happening. And these acts were called the Intolerable Acts. They had a different name in Parliament, but the colonists called them Intolerable Acts. So that was the name that stuck. These primarily meant that no trade was allowed to happen in Boston Harbor until the Bostonians, the people in Boston, paid for all the tea they had dumped in the harbor. Another rule said no more meetings. They wanted to avoid the Sons of Liberty happening again. And lastly, they decided to put a British soldier, or a commander, as the governor of Boston, so that he could look over things and make sure that they were okay. Now, there were other rules and things that were applied to other colonists, but the main ones were applied to Boston. And the colonists said, we need to have a meeting. This is just unacceptable. So their first meeting was called the First Continental Congress, and it happened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1774. It included leaders from all of the colonies, and they met together and they made a petition and sent it to George III, saying that it was unfair for them to be paying any taxes without representation. Now, at the time that they sent this petition, they started to prepare their generals and people for war in the colonies. Now, the colonies didn't have any armies, so they had to train each other how to fight. So they all came together and they called themselves the Minutemen because they were ready to fight at any minute. And they were getting ready to fight in places like Concord and Lexington, which were near Boston. Now, Great Britain, as it was responding to this petition, they knew that they also needed to prepare because the colonists surely would be at the same time. And they brought everyone, all their soldiers, to the New World to prepare for this. And at the time, the British soldiers knew that a lot of these Minutemen were fighting and preparing to battle in Concord. That was where all of the weapons that they had been storing were collected and gathered. And so they decided to do a sneak attack in the middle of the night. The British troops would go into Lexington and then go into Concord and take all the weapons away from the Minutemen. So they had nothing to battle with. And when they did that, they thought it was going to be a surprise. However, news spread that this was going to happen. And the colonists were not going to allow them to do a sneak attack on them. So what they decided to do is send one of the Sons of Liberty, Paul Revere, on a run with his horse, alerting everybody on his way to Concord that there was going to be an attack by the British. So he got on his horse in the middle of the night and he ran across different colonies, different towns, yelling, "The British are coming, the British are coming." And people in Lexington woke up and got ready and fought against the British on their way, but lost. Then the British went on to Concord, and this time the Minutemen were ready and were not going to take no. They were not going to lose. And so they battled with the British, and they were winning. And the British decided to retreat and go back to Boston, and the Minutemen followed them, attacking them all along the way. The war had officially begun now. And so they decided to have a second meeting of all of these leaders from the colonies. And this was the Second Continental Congress. And this one happened in 1776, again in Philadelphia. And this time, the person chose to write this new message to the king was Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. Jefferson drafted this manifest, this declaration of what they wanted in the colonies, and he sent it to the king. This was called the Declaration of Independence, and it was written on July 4th, American Independence Day. Now, this declaration said that we see ourselves as separate from the Great Britain and England country. We see ourselves as separate. We deserve to have representation if we are to work together with you, all of these things, and that they refused to pay taxes anymore. Now, all of this led to many, many fights, including one that was mentioned in our book called the Battle of Bunker Hill. You should know the Battle of Bunker Hill wasn't actually fought on Bunker Hill. It was fought on the hill next door called Breed Hill. And the British just mistaken the names. Now, battles like this were happening all across the colonies, and they decided to put General George Washington in charge of the Continental Army. That same George Washington we had heard about in our previous chapter. Now, the British did outnumber the Americans greatly, and so at first they were losing. And George Washington said the only way we can properly get the upper hand, win, is if we do a sneak attack, and we do it on a day that they're least expecting us to attack. And that was going to be on Christmas Day. So they all gathered together on the night of Christmas Day, and they went on their boat across the Delaware River. And across the Delaware River on the other side was a major encampment of British and German troops. The German troops were sent to help the British. Now, they decided that if they snuck in while everyone was merry and happy and celebrating Christmas, that they could get them by surprise. And that they did. They were able to win George Washington and his troops, and that became a big change in events for them. Their luck was changing. Soon after, French and Netherlands, Dutch soldiers came to support the colonists. They also didn't want England to win, and so they decided to help and give them those numbers that they needed. Now, with more people on the side of the Americans, they really started to win and win and win, and eventually they won the entire war. Finally, in 1783, George III signed an agreement saying, fine, you can be free. You are no longer part of Great Britain. And that was how America was born. That's it for chapter 22. I'll see you next time for chapter 23. Bye-bye.